I don't really like to invest in airlines. Very competitive industry, very little when it comes to mode of entry, and when shit hits the fan, these stocks crash hard. But there's one company which kinda went against this trend. RYANAir. They, like every other airplane company, dipped in 2020, but since then the stock has more than doubled. While other companies came out of COVID with a huge amount of debt and a lot of problems, RYANAir has recovered successfully. So let's look into RYANAir. Is it maybe a buy? We can see RYANAir operates all over Europe, but they're different. They're a very low-cost airline. And when they say, for example, they fly to, I don't know, Paris, that doesn't mean they fly directly to Paris. You know, if you buy via Lufthansa or something in Europe, you fly directly into the center of Paris, or at least the closest airport there. Not RYANAir. They usually fly to secondary airports that are further out of the city. And this is how they save a lot of money. Now, I told you this is a low-cost airline. How low-cost is low-cost? Well, the average RYANAir fare was 52 euros. So this is a company that has perfected the industry. A load factor of 95%. To give you an idea, United is around 85%. And while this 10% doesn't really sound that much like a difference, that little bit extra matters. To a certain point, you just need to have a certain amount of guests to just cover the costs, and everything beyond is profit. They're also returning a bunch of cash. They bought back 700 million euros worth of shares, now increased that to 800 million euros, on a market cap of 22 billion. Not bad. Another interim dividend. Since 2014, they nearly tripled revenues. For an airline company, that is very fantastic. They didn't really steal market share as so much they created a new market. Before, if you wanted to, went from Paris to Berlin, you took the train or you flew, spent 300 euros. So you didn't really do it unless it was like a very big vacation or something. But this created a new trend, RYANAir. Now you can just hop into a plane for 50 euros, go there, and that's it. This is something you can do over a weekend. You don't have to go on a month-long vacation to really say, ooh, now this is worth it. But then let's look, how did they do during the pandemic? Of course, their revenue also shrank extremely there and rebounded back. Now this is how airlines really get in trouble, because during those times, they either have to issue shares or a bunch of debt. So what did RYANAir do? They didn't really issue shares. They stopped buying back shares, which is kind of sad, but it's better than diluting you. They probably took on a huge amount of debt then. They took on some debt. They took on around 2 billion of debt, which is not too much actually. And they started paying that back aggressively afterwards. This is why they stopped buying back shares. They wanted to get that debt out of the way. Now why is that the case? Like I already said, RYANAir is a low-cost airline. And normal airlines have way higher cost. They have way more crew. They have way more airport spots reserved, which all cost money even if you don't fly. So if it shuts down, you have a lot of running expenses. RYANAir didn't have a lot of running expenses. So they were able to go through this period relatively well. So their business model is kind of protected against these kind of shocks. But RYANAir has another weakness: costs. Their whole business relies on people wanting this 50 euro ticket. Sometimes even 10 euro or something, if you get it really cheap, if they just want to fill that last plane seat. But you need to be able to offer this. And this is so difficult to offer. And now the CEO is even saying they're gonna raise prices by over 30%. And that would already be much for a normal airline. But the issue with RYANAir, every little cent at these price segments matter. If you're gonna fly at a higher end airline, or just a normal airline, maybe 10 euro for another flight would not matter to you that much. You'd think, meh, I like this airline better, I've had better experiences with them, I'm willing to pay the 10 euros more. But 10 euro on this are 20% of the ticket price, if it's 50 euro on average. And then you're maybe gonna think, hold on, there are some other low-cost airlines who are now very competitive with those prices, plus at this point, I might not even fly. And this squeezes the whole segment. Now, at one point, they have to do this because of those higher costs. Like I said, the operating income has stalled. It has not kept up with the growth. It's back to levels of 2017. And that is because of those higher fees, higher operating expenses. If they're gonna have to go back to their margins, currently they would have to raise prices 30% to get to their previous growth trajectory. But the issue is, customers are not gonna accept that 30% increase in this very, very highly competitive system of every cent matters. Literally every cent that you cut and give on to the customers matters, because that gains your market share. And if you're gonna raise price by 30%, even if it's over 4 years like they say, other low-cost airlines will not have to do that much, because most of them are also owned by other companies which have higher brand airlines, which can subsidize the lower income ones. Every little bit of delay, every little bit of increase in costs drives up this cost. And for example, in Germany, we raised a lot of fees and taxes. This made RYANAir partially leave the German market. They were not huge increases, there were some increases, but it made it unprofitable for them to be here. And if that happens to multiple markets, obviously this revenue growth is gonna go bye-bye. you really shifted the risk from the usual seasonality in the airline industry that is very heavily due to shocks to one that where the long-term business changes, the long-term costs, not a short rise in fuel costs, not a short closure because of a pandemic or something. No, long-term costs like taxes and fees change, then this business doesn't work anymore. But if everything goes well, you can now expect share buybacks and some nice dividends. Where operating cash flow is going down. New fees are introduced, a lot of costs are hitting them, especially labor and the fees are hitting them from the airports, and also fuel is getting kinda expensive right now. Now, will this revert eventually? Probably. It will go back to normal. And now then is the question, where do you land here on a permanent free cash flow? Currently we're sitting at 1 billion. Let's just take 1.2 billion. Just to give them a bit of growth over the long term, and this might even be low, but let's just be conservative. That's around an 18 multiple, which is not that low. At the same time, they basically return all the cash to shareholders via dividends and share buybacks. I just want to say, this dividend is false, by the way. They're not paying out 5% dividend, would be kind of nice. Their trailing dividend is around 60 cents per share right now. Not that high, but how much am I willing to pay for the stock now? Currently, if we assume those 1.2 billion in free cash flow, it is around 1.05 euros per share. Now, what are they gonna grow at? Historically, they have had great growth rates in the 10%, but the issue is, they created this market. If they want to continue to grow these growth rates, they would have to take market share from other competitors, and they have not really been successful at that. And I don't really see them naturally growing above 5 to 6% for the next 10 years. So, now of course we're going to have some share buybacks, 2 to 3% per year probably. I would say around 5% revenue growth, 3% share buybacks, slight deceleration in revenue growth after that, 13 multiple. It is a good business. Yes, it's better than a normal airline stock. But the issue is, it's still an airline. It's still very heavily dependent on costs, especially because it's such a low-budget airline. If a government or if the EU decides to implement a higher CO2 tax on fuel, or just raises some prices, this is going to heavily hit their margins. So, there's still a risky stock. Payout ratio of 60% with a little deduction due to taxes. This would give us an intrinsic value of 15 euros a share. Heavily below the current value. So, I just don't really see RYANAir right now. Even if it goes better, 10%, 8%, 20 euros, we can see, we're just not getting that. There's a reason why operating income has not moved since 2017. Yes, they had the recovery after the pandemic, but it has went down again with rising costs, and I don't really see them sustainably growing in the 10% or 20% range anymore. They had their time in 2015, when they just started making up the market. But ever since then, after the pandemic, they just have recovered the revenue that they lost, and now it went back to normal. So I don't really see this being a great investment. It's an airline stock. I would own it at a very cheap price. I wouldn't have even bought it during the pandemic years probably. It wasn't cheap enough. This is a stock that I'm happily passing on. I'm not really keen on adding it to my portfolio. This would be one of those cigar butts. What do you think about it? Write down below. Have a good day.